So let me now pass the baton to another CLDE lead partner and my colleague, Yolanda Watson-Spiva, President of Complete College America. Yolanda, off to you.
Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate that. Again, my name is Yolanda Watson-Spiva, and I serve as the president of Complete College America, also known as CCA, a lead partner in the CLDE Coalition. I'm also proud to be a board member of Campus Compact, which is also one of the other 5 lead partners. And as a board member, I want to thank Compact, which has done so much to facilitate both this forum and the earlier CLDE forum on college civic learning that we held in December. Welcome all, one and all, to this session. Throughout this forum so far, you've heard vigorous debate in both plenary and concurrent sessions about the core purposes of college civic learning. In this session, we're going to examine these multiple purposes in relationship to one another. And we're also going to especially hear and think about this in relationship to students' own growth as knowledgeable civic participants and change makers. We're going to first hear, however, from Carol Gary Schneider about the CLDE Coalition's draft framework for college civic learning, what it is, and how educators can use it. And then we invited 3 leaders to examine this framework from their own vantage points as heads of national initiatives, state-level initiatives, and P20 partnerships. I will introduce them now, and when they speak, they'll tell you more about the work they're doing to help make college civic learning both inclusive and high impact for our democracy and for students themselves. Our first panelist is Marisol Morales. Our second is Nancy Shapiro, and the third is Elaine Ikeda. And now we'll hear from Carol Gary Schneider about the learning framework and how it fits into the CLDE Coalition's efforts to accelerate the college civic learning movement. Hey, Carol, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Yolanda, and Rob, too. And I hope that those of you who've joined us for this forum are getting to see the wonderful people who have come together to form this coalition to try to further galvanize the college civic learning movement that is powerful on campus, but not yet a high priority for policy. So we'll be talking about the coalition's work in a minute, but first I just want to take you through the purpose of this session, which is discussion of a proposed shared framework for civic and democratic, small d democratic learning in college. So the session overview is this. We're going to take a look at the framework, the component parts of it, how they draw together the different aspects of college civic learning that you heard about yesterday and we'll hear more about later today in the concurrent sessions. How do we pull it all together in a shared vision around which we can rally people? And especially, how can we clarify the distinctive role of higher education in building new capacity for this democracy? We know that the foundations the K-12 lays are absolutely essential. The CLDE Coalition is supporting the reform movements led by Educating for American Democracy in K-12 history, K-12 civics. What do we add to this? Why should college civic learning be a priority? And what is distinctive about our role in building capacity for our democracy? So you've already heard about the 5 partners who are the founders of this coalition. The thing that's important for you to know is this. We deliberately brought together educational organizations, Campus Compact, which was up in 1985, getting this whole work started, AAC&U, which joined in the 90s, working on diversity, democracy, disparity, and what it means to educate students for a diverse democracy. But we brought those together with policy influencers, organizations like Complete College America, which have so much influence right now on the priorities that are set in states, that are set nationally, and that are also set on campuses. How do we pull policy leadership and educational leadership together in support of new capacity, new learning for our democracy? The second thing that's important to know is that it's not just 5 organizations. We have 70 organizational partners that have signed on to be part of this. You can see the website address right there. You can learn more about the partners on the website. And we have, as Rob has already said, lots of work going on, work in the states, work with accreditors. Lots of things are happening. But very soon as we began our work 2 years ago, it became clear that we needed to clarify exactly what we meant by college civic learning. And that is the purpose of this framework that you're going to take a look at. And it is the purpose of this session. So let's just stop and linger for a minute over the vision that has brought this coalition and its 70 partners together. There are today some 19 million students in American higher education. Imagine if every one of them was devoting time and talent and creativity to shaping the kind of democracy we want to live in. We heard Melody Barnes say yesterday that we're all grappling with the friction between the ideals and aspirations we hold as a democracy and the realities that too many of our fellow citizens are struggling with and the problems that we face as a global community. Imagine if every college student was spending some part of his or her time in higher education on those issues. What an asset indeed we would be to our democracy. So what is civic learning for an engaged democracy? As we began this work, it became clear that there are multiple movements afoot, some of them longstanding, some of them fairly recent, each of them with powerful champions, and each of them with legitimate claims to our time and attention as we think about what should students be taking away from their college studies that is important to democracy and important to our shared future. So I'm just going to walk through these four multiple meanings quickly, and then we'll look at how they have influenced the design of the draft framework for college civic learning. The first one is the student's own development of civic identity, a sense of public purpose, a sense that he or she has a voice, has social agency and power, and some sense of the issues they actually want to work on in this democracy. Students themselves are passionate on this issue. If you've heard some of the students either in the December forum or yesterday, you hear them talking about finding a new sense of self through this kind of work. And it's important to them, and it's important to the faculty who work with them and the staff who work with them. But there's a whole other movement out there, which is the notion of the required course on constitutional democracy. You heard about that in a plenary yesterday. There are 10 states that already require all students in public higher education to do some kind of a civic learning course, sometimes two. Some of them are longstanding, like in the CSU system. Some of them are quite new, like the one you heard about in the plenary yesterday that was designed by the legislature for faculty in South Carolina to teach. And you heard about the creative response that faculty have made to that expectation. The third movement is probably the most venerable. It's where Campus Compact has had the most influence on higher education. It's the notion that we learn democracy by doing democracy. We don't just learn about it. We don't just learn what its ideals are. We actually engage ourselves with some of the issues that we need to work on in civil society and in our own communities. So service learning is the powerhouse in this area. We have far more evidence on service learning than on any other aspect of college civic learning. And what we know is that it's powerful for completion. Students are more likely to complete if they're actually doing this kind of thing. And we know that it's powerful for civic learning as well. And then there's a fourth strand, which you've heard a lot about in this forum, and we'll hear more about in the next plenary and some of the concurrence. It has different names. I've put here the title Necessary Skills. But some people call it civic free inquiry, free academic inquiry, civil discourse, civil dialogue. It's the whole notion that we as a democracy are in almost desperate need of new capacity to listen to and with one another, to believe that we have something to learn from people who disagree with us, and to bring those capacities to the public square, but also to our workplace. So those are the four big strands that we've seen. And I invite you, if you think we're missing something, this whole thing is being put in front of you for your feedback and your constructive suggestions as to how to strengthen it. So be sure to let us know if, in fact, you think we are missing something important. The draft framework that we're putting in front of you today draws from all those strands. It seeks to build from the values and strengths of the different movements in higher education to enlarge and enrich and deepen our students' engagement with democracy and engagement with the world in which they are a part. So there are four component elements to this framework, and I'll just walk you through them, and then we will go into each in a little bit more detail. The centerpiece, responsible civic engagement, points to students themselves, students' own journeys as civic actors and participants. The one at the top is democratic knowledge and also levers for change, not just how is our democracy supposed to work, but how do we help it work better. The next is practical experience, which is our name for those action projects where students are learning by doing, working with community partners. And the fourth, high value skills, encompasses the deliberative democracy skills, but some others as well, as I'll talk about. So as I said, students themselves and their own journeys stand at the center of this. What we're interested in is how students can benefit from this kind of learning and engagement in college, what kind of difference it makes to them as people who are growing and seeking to enrich and enlarge their role and share in the society, but also what does it bring to our public square? How does democracy benefit? How does the workplace benefit from all of this? So students should have opportunities, and more than one we're proposing, to reflect on who they are as people when they arrive in college, what experiences have shaped, for positive or negative, their sense of their own role in this democracy, whether it works for them or doesn't, the societal roles they want to take, their eventual development of civic agency and civic purpose. It's important to emphasize that we don't see this telling students what they should think about or work on. Rather, we remind them that democracy is everybody's shared responsibility, and the particular ways they choose to exercise their social power in democracy and in their neighborhoods is up to them. They choose the issues, they choose the strategies. Our job as educators is to build their capacity to make those choices and their awareness that the kind of choices they make matter to our shared future. The next component is democratic knowledge and levers for change. We're accepting the notion that we do need that required course and that it should be engaging students with the organizing principles for a free society. But we're also proposing that this isn't just an American project, that knowing how American democracy works is necessary but not sufficient when students are civic participants in the world's most influential and powerful global democracy, and when global democracy is itself under siege around the globe. So we're suggesting that part of this should be exploration of comparative constitutionalism, comparative movements, both for and against democracy, freedom movements, social justice movements, and deep engagement with the debates, sometimes vigorous, sometimes dangerous, that we've been having as a society since we first became a republic. What are those principles? What is their meaning and application? To whom do they apply? What do these principles require of us in practice? And not just learning about, but the levers for change that are built into our constitutional system at multiple levels, local, state, federal, global, but also the social movements, social influence movements that make such a difference in our current world. But there's another component to this framework, the democratic knowledge and levers for change, and that has to do with students' choice of majors and intended careers. Virtually every student who goes to American higher education today either is preparing for a career or is already in one and is coming back to school to strengthen their prospects for promotion or to change to a different line of work. For all of them, work is central, and they choose majors because they believe those majors will build their opportunity and flexibility in our economy. But every single field for which a student is preparing has its own public issues and policy and ethical and equity questions, every one of them. Just think about the debates we're having in public health, education, technology, artificial intelligence, the role of business, what business owes communities, its own workers, et cetera. All these issues are public good issues. They're civic issues, and students deserve an opportunity to work on them in the context of their majors, both conceptually in terms of the knowledge issues, but also through that applied learning, learning by doing. So those are the first two components, students' own journeys, the democratic knowledge. The other two are practical experience and the high value skills. And I'll now turn to those. Practical experience, as I've already said, is in many ways the powerhouse of the college civic learning movement. It's the issue on which we have the most evidence. And when students participate in applied learning projects, service learning, or other forms of applied learning, they're more likely to complete college. They're more likely to report that they are developing practical skills that matter in getting problems solved, both in the civil society, but also in the economy. And they are more likely to say that they have a new understanding of their responsibilities to self and others. So when they do these projects, it's good for them and it's good for democracy, but it's also good for the workplace. An important component of this is that students will have opportunities to think about what they're learning from their applied experiences. If they go into a community to work with community partners and community organizations, gaining credit for it back in the curriculum, but actually spending a lot of their time in the field, what are they learning from all that? And how is their learning different from other people's learning? Because all of us filter things through our own prisms of meaning making and responsibility. So guided reflection is an important part of the practical experience. It's an important source of the civic learning and personal development for our students. And now the high value skills. And I've emphasized here, practice not just in one course, but from first to final year, and preferably before they ever get to college and taken to a higher level once they are in college. A couple of these I've labeled democracy necessities. I'll have to see if our panelists agree with me. That for our moment in time when we are so polarized and so lacking in social trust in one another, when we don't believe in our institutions and when we have grave doubts about people whose views are different from our own, that working on productive engagement across difference is absolutely necessary to this democracy. And there are many kinds of such engagement. It's intellectual, always been part of a strong liberal education to have different points of view, academic, scholarly, community points of view, but also scholarly versus the community. What does the community have to say about this issue? Sociocultural, religious, political, economic. How do our different standpoints influence what we see, and how can we learn from people who come from different standpoints? And how do we develop the skills of bridge building so that we can actually work together with people even when we profoundly disagree on many of the issues and questions? And what does it mean to create greater opportunity in our society, greater equity, greater inclusion? What is the role of college in building those capacities for our students and for our democracy? But there are other high value skills as well. And I'm going to guess that if you're out listening from a campus, you already have some version of these on the learning outcomes you've already developed for your students and may even be assessing. Critical inquiry, evidence-based reasoning, communication skills of different kinds, collaborative problem solving with diverse partners, digital media information literacy. Some would want to add disinformation literacy because so much of what people think they know is in fact fueled from dubious sources. And students need to become, citizens need to become detectives in ferreting out evidence that actually has validity behind it from things that are being said but are not true. So how and where does all this happen? It happens in the message of this framework is it doesn't happen in one course. That one course may be necessary. It is far from sufficient. Students need to be working on these skills and inquiries and projects and applications and reflections across the entire educational experience. We develop the kind of mindset that supports our active participation in democracy through practice and through guided reflection. And one way I like to think about it is that we need to create spiraled civic learning pathways that extend through the entire educational experience, building a certain sense of shared purpose, and helping the students and democracy reap rich benefits from this learning. So all of the zones that organize the undergraduate experience are places where this can happen. If you're working on strengthening your first year experience, the courses that provide momentum to students and keep them in college, this is a very good place to be bringing in civic inquiry, civic reflection, identity reflection, to ask students, what questions do you care about? What questions do you want to work on? And what will you need to learn to be able to work on those questions effectively? General education, I was head of AAC&U for 18 years. Every one of our members is always working on general education. They've either just finished a review or they're about to start one or in the midst of one now. Our argument has been, and the argument of this framework is, the general education is not just the first 2 years. It should be spiraled through the entire educational experience, raising questions, problems, integrative themes that students can work on that are related to public good questions in their professions and in civil society. Majors, as I've already said, students need the opportunity to look at issues that matter to their fields, but to look at them through multidisciplinary lenses, not just through their one field's prisms, but to explore issues from different points of view. Many institutions are working on making high-impact practices more equitable, more inclusive, and more effective for students, something that all students will do as opposed to something that's just there. high impact practices, which include e-portfolios, are natural zones for every one of the civic inquiry problem-centered explorations that we're recommending in this framework for our students. So that's the framework. Just one more comment that those of you who know AAC&U's work on liberal learning, all of this is just another way of thinking about liberal learning across the curriculum, across the disciplines, creating connections between the students' formal learning and their lives in society, their lives in community, their capacity to solve problems, both in the workplace and in civil society. I hope you'll take a look at what AAC&U has to say about liberal learning. The opposite of liberal learning is not conservative learning, it's authoritarian learning. And this kind of learning is what we are proposing as necessary foundations for the vitality and sustainability of a just and inclusive democracy. So that's the proposed framework. It is a draft. It has been developed by members of the coalition. We've had a lot of feedback from partners, educational advisors. You can find their names on the website. We're starting to road test it. We're putting it in front of everyone who's attending this forum. And we're starting now with my fellow panelists to see, what do you think of it? And does this actually get at those the distinctive role of higher education in building capacity for our democracy and benefits for our students? How can we improve it? We assume it can be improved, and we know that you are the people to tell us how to make it better. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And as you've heard, we're basically presenting this framework as a work in progress. This is not meant to be fixed on written in stone or anything like that. This is really a time for us to hear from you, get your insights on this. And so as we think about how we galvanize the civic learning movement, we want to make sure that our panelists give us ideas and feedback that will hopefully strengthen it. And so thank you to our panelists that are here to help us do that. And so please join me in welcoming again Dr. Marisol Morales. Great to see you. How are you?
Good. How are you? Good to
I'm
see
great.
you well.
Thank you. So as you think about your work at the Carnegie elective classification and the ways in which we're trying to accelerate the spread of college civic learning through the Carnegie classifications, what ways do you think this framework might be helpful as a shared learning framework as we road test this?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for the invitation to be in conversation with such great people. So I very much appreciate that. I think first and foremost, one of the things that we've been talking about, at least in terms of the community engagement electives, is really having a more pronounced space within the application process that talks about democratic and civic learning. That's something that's sort of been throughout the application, but there's not one specific area where we have collected that data. And so for us, the framework was really helpful in thinking about the ways, as we're preparing to do the edits to the 2026 application, the ways in which we can utilize this framework to think about the buckets that we might need to include for campuses to report on the kind of civic and democratic engagement that they have going on campus. In addition to this, I think that it helps to focus our work and even think about the kind of rich data that we're going to be able to collect from the next application cycle and chart it against, what we're seeing in the conversations we're actually having as we're beginning to expand the community engagement elective outside of the United States. So, we have just launched the community engagement elective in Australia. We will be launching this year in Canada, and we've had conversations with other countries that are not democracies that are interested in the community engagement elective. And so how do we think about this framework? How do we think about sort of the conversations about democracy as we're also beginning to expand the reach of the electives outside of the United States? The other thing I think is what kind of critical conversations can come from thinking about this framework, right? There is an assumption, I think, many times in this field that, democracy is just the best. That is what we aspire to, but there's not always that critical perspective on democracy that we really need in the ways that it has not served every person in this country equally. And so the ways in which we can interrogate that, utilize this as a avenue to begin to interrogate that, I think the more we can not only increase sort of democratic learning for our students, but also expand that into what we're seeing in communities, right? Reasons why particular folks don't feel like their vote matters, right? We need to have a conversation about that. Reasons why, you know, the kind of traditional ways that we have measured democratic engagement might not always work for all communities, right? And even in our discussions about the framework, my question is, it centers around this responsible civic engagement, and who determines what's responsible, right? Where does that conversation about responsible belong? And so I think that this is a really good start for those conversations. Apologies, my dog is also in support of this. These are really good starts for these conversations, but I think that is the point, right? We need to create more spaces for those conversations. The way that we can utilize the classification to begin to gather that data, have conversations, and move this work forward on campuses is really exciting to me. And I'm really, a champion of thinking about how do we do this in coalition and community with one another.
Absolutely. And Marisol, we'll definitely get back to your point about responsible civic engagement. So thank you for raising that point. And so Nancy, same question to you. How do you think we might be able to use this sort of shared learning framework in your work at the Maryland State System?
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. And secondly, for the question, because I'm here not just representing the University System of Maryland and the system of perspective, but I'm part of the coalition for the entire coalition around democratic engagement. And we've put together, Carol mentioned this multi-state collaborative. And I first wanted to just very briefly describe what a multi-state collaborative means in the context of civic learning and democratic engagement, and then why. So early on, when Carol and her colleagues and her partners talked about how to pull together a national commitment to fostering civic learning, democratic engagement in higher education, she turned to the state higher ed leaders. She turned to SHEO, as Rob described early on. She also turned to NASH, the National Association of System Heads, and said, where can we pull states that would be willing to make a commitment up front to do this? And she found four states that would start this multi-state collaboration: Maryland, Massachusetts, Virginia, and Utah. Those chancellors or state higher ed SHEOs signed a commitment saying that they were going to prioritize civic learning, democracy engagement. And the commitment's on the website, and you can take a look at what that commitment means. Since then, we've brought in a few, and I'm co-chairing this initiative, sort of leading this initiative with my colleague, Richard Freeland from Massachusetts. He was the SHEO in Massachusetts, and he was the one who spearheaded the Massachusetts work to make civic learning an expected outcome for Massachusetts learning outcomes in general education and higher education. So he's like an expert here. But we've brought on a couple of other states already. Kentucky, Florida, Arizona have moved into this space, and we're talking with half a dozen others: CUNY, New York, Pennsylvania, California, Texas, a bunch of other states. So what does it mean that a state higher ed system would make a commitment to this? And why is that important? I think what's interesting about the framework is that it speaks to both the state and system level work and the campus level work. And I think that Marisol nailed that when she said she's looking for the way that they can identify the activities, the work that's going on at the institutions to fit into the buckets that Carol presented in the framework. But systems and states have a different role. We don't have students, all right? There are no students in my office. What we have in our office is the ability to frame policy initiatives. We work, for example, very closely with the K-12 schools. What's the relationship of this framework to the work that's already being done in the K-12 schools around civic learning? I think that it's important for us to be aware of that work. At the system, my office, my office, one of the titles is the P20 office, preschool through graduate school or career. So one question systems address is, how do we make that work for students across the P20 system? Another thing that systems do is they do a lot with transfer and articulation. To the extent that community college students form almost 50% of the University System of Maryland population, if we're not working across the state, excuse me, across the state with the learning outcomes at every level, then we're missing an opportunity. So I think that, and the third thing that systems do is we really talk about broad definitions and metrics, like Marisol, looking for those buckets. How do we assess? How do we learn what our campuses are doing well, and where they need work, and where they need help, and where they need support? And I think that the framework allows us to begin to identify not every campus or every program is going to be strong in every aspect of this framework. And yet, the system state perspective is to look a little deeper and say, okay, which of our institutions are doing really well in a particular area, and can we use that expertise across the system? A lot of system work is pulling out best highlights and examples and scaling that. So I would say that from our perspective, from the perspective of system state, we're not looking at the individual activities that are going on, whether or not an activity fits into a service learning bucket, but rather, where do we see the whole framing of the student's experience? When I would talk to people about what P20 is, I say, from my perspective, I want students to have a seamless experience going from kindergarten to middle school, to high school, to community college, or a four-year university, to graduate school and career. What's the seamlessness that we can create at the system and state level for this work? Because as Carol framed it, it's the essential, it is the necessary and essential work. So I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Nancy. I appreciate your thoughtfulness on this topic. And Elaine, please join us in the conversation. As I think about your work as the Executive Director of LEAD California, how do you see this framework potentially being useful to the institutions within the state, but of course with the context of California?
Great. Thank you very much. And I add my appreciation along with the other panelists on being invited to this conversation. It might be helpful for me to first just give a little context of what LEAD California is. We are formally known as California Campus Compact, and we build the collective commitment and capacity of colleges, universities, and communities throughout California to advance civic and community engagement for a healthy, just, and democratic society. And we are, in California, the only coalition that brings together the variety of two-year, four-year public-private institutions around a common commitment to higher education's civic purposes. So we are a powerful ally in making the case for civic engagement, public service, and student involvement with campus and community partnerships, and for sustaining the momentum for higher education's public service role in California. And I am honored to also be to have been a part of the CLDE conversations, the coalition conversations, serving on the policy committee. So been very familiar with the work that's been taking place over the past few couple of years. And I want to say that I think it's interesting, we're all representing entities beyond, as Nancy said, beyond just the campus here. So I think that the coalition work is really, really important. And a role that we play in California as an organization is to support our campuses as they attempt to work with faculty to instill service learning courses. We actually led about 12 years ago a faculty fellows program that focused on service learning for political engagement. So how do you go beyond just teaching a regular service learning course, but adding an element adding practices and pedagogy that helps to educate students more to be engaged in the democracy. And that actually led to a really interesting book that the faculty put together of the democratic dilemmas of teaching in that way, the issues that came up in trying to teach in a nonpartisan way, but to really stimulate students to actually get interested in being engaged in more political activities rather than just doing volunteerism and so forth. I think one of the things that a framework like this can do, both for an organization like mine and the others here, it's always helpful to have something to have people look at, to have the campuses. I think the crucible moment that AAC&U did many years ago was such a document that our campuses were like, let's look at this. What do we think about it? How do we want to react to it? Do we embrace it? Where do we find ourselves with a different vision for our campus or the same vision? So it's helpful for us to leverage and have conversations. Something, again, we do in California's, with Lead California's, when a movement of something is taking place, when we started talking more about civic engagement from service learning, we held regional dialogues around the state. California is a big state, so we had to have quite a few dialogues, and held conversations with our practitioners and faculty on the campus and our administrators. What does it mean, civic engagement? What are we talking about? How is that different than just service learning? And how do the two complement each other? So having a framework like this helps us to have a beginning talking point, to have conversations at the state level, and also at the individual campus level. And I'll mention one other thing that I want to build off what Nancy said about the P20 effort. I'm part of a statewide coalition called Californians for Civic Learning here in California. It's a statewide strategy coalition, I would say, as many of you already talked about, with many leaders in both K-12, and I represent higher education, but we also have several really seasoned policy makers on that in this coalition. And we're trying to influence policymakers. We're trying to build a movement and a network in California to influence public education. Primarily right now, we're starting with K-12, but hoping that that extends beyond that. And one of the things that did happen in California that folks may not be aware of is last year, the legislators passed the California State Seal of Civic Engagement with a $5 million budget to grant out to school systems to develop more civic engagement, civic education in the K-12. And also people are aware, it's been in the news a lot, the ethnic studies requirement. And I think that's an important piece to add to this conversation of how the two really do go hand in hand, civic education and the ethnic studies element. So we've been having those conversations in California as well.
Well, Elaine, thank you so much for those insights. It really helps to inform the perspective here for this conversation. So with those thoughts and those insights, let's go and delve into the framework itself, because we know that there have been some thoughts that have been communicated, but I'd love to hear from our panelists. And I mentioned to Marisol, we'd come back to her. So we'll start with you, Marisol, on if you could weigh in on, how you find the concept of responsible engagement, but any other things that you think would help to sharpen or clarify this framework as a communications tool for our shared work.
Sure. Well, I think in terms of responsible framework, what worries me is, who determines the level of responsibility, right? For some communities, responsibility is not necessarily going to vote, but it is more grassroots efforts, right? There may be questions about, legal status, right? And so being able to be conscious of that in the ways that there's limitations to that, or even, young people under the age of 18 and their civic engagement. So nuancing that more. I think too, what is the role that community plays in helping us to find those avenues, right? Either through partnership or reciprocity. What are the ways, I know in my own experience, coming from a family who, definitely believed in voting, went and talked about it, but I didn't really feel my agency until I got to work on more grassroots community efforts where I actually saw what being part of a civil society meant outside of a charity model. And so I think those linkages to sort of justice-oriented work, the avenues that our students have through either courses or organizations that they're already, coming in working for. I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing, particularly in this generation of students and, with the Black Lives Matters movement, is that many of those students are already coming to our campuses, having been part of those movements, as in grammar school or in high school. And so how do we create opportunities for them to use that prior learning, that prior engagement in those portfolios, right? So I think one is getting outside of the higher education bubble to understand that our students are already coming in with these assets and these experiences from their own neighborhoods or communities, and then bringing that into the framework to expand it and nuance the conversation. The other thing that I would say is that, there are different sort of levers that trigger our students' engagement, right? For me, it was learning about Puerto Rican history and Puerto Rican culture and the way that we influence the city of Chicago, right? I saw myself in the curriculum that way. And I think that speaks to what Elaine was talking about in terms of the ethnic studies. What are those other opportunities that might exist? It might be, students coming in with, religious backgrounds or this connection to serving through the religious affiliation. For other students, it may be, through civil rights types of movements or LGBTQ movements. And so, making sure that students see the variety of those avenues reflective in this will be important. And I think also it's that interrogation of democracy. I think particularly for this set of young people, it's going to be really important to be able to continue to justify why, even especially as they're learning sort of the history of exclusion that happened in this democracy, right? I think, lastly, I'll say, sometimes we speak about our democracy in this sense of nostalgia and sort of getting back to this, place where our democracy was really thriving. But for many communities, that really never existed. So I think it's putting aside this nostalgia and really moving towards a vision of democracy that speaks to the aspirations that we have yet to achieve, but that we are capable of achieving.
Can I just ask a question? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that the framework now has that tinge of nostalgia?
I don't think the framework has it per se, but I think in the discussions of the framework that can come up, right? Because again, I think there's still this assumption of the rightness of democracy. And I'm not saying that democracy is not right. I believe it is, but it is also with a critical perspective. And I think that these are also the conversations that we're seeing, as we work with our international partners and as they're also beginning to interrogate their own histories of colonialism, right? And their own histories or their own presence of not being as welcoming to the harvest of empire, right? All of these folks who have been impacted by their colonialism in these democratic spaces that they've created in their countries. And so there's an interrogation that I think needs to be front and center in a way that doesn't sort of gloss over it as democracy is just great, but that really says that this is an ideal that we work towards, and that in that working towards, we interrogate the difficult. We interrogate the histories of exclusion, the history of colonialism, all of these that have been also part. I think we've talked about democracy at the same time as we've engaged in colonialism. And so how do we bring those two pieces together in a way that really speaks to both the justice and injustice aspects that we have seen in our democracy? So I think while the framework provides a really good overview, it is in the meat of those discussions that has to rise to the top.
If I could say something to build off what Marisol is talking about, I've been seeing in the news these discussions about that the teaching our Constitution and all that should be about teaching patriotism, right? And so I really appreciate what Marisol's saying about the depth and the different lenses that we all come to this. I appreciate you talking about what the generation that's coming in now into college, into high school and college, and what they're experiencing. And so for me, one piece of the framework that I see it there, and when we talk about, you know, being changed, helping them to be engaged, and perhaps there's a hint about talking about them being change agents. I don't feel like that's explicitly there, about recognizing their own civic agency and being the change makers and our future leaders. But I guess what I feel might be a little bit missing, that is a part of the reason why my organization came to be, why college presidents got together and created this organization, is the focus that seemed to come around the 80s of intense individualism. And that has continued, and even with social media, this individualism. And so I guess maybe I'm seeing us as we are all part of this strength of coalitions. We all believe in it. We work for organizations that are trying to support that kind of the coalition and the powerfulness of that. And Marisol talked about it with what we see in the community and all these social justice movements. So I guess I'm wondering if there might be some language to talk about, to emphasize more the collective, the coalition building. You mentioned, Carol, building social trust. I think there's a lot of that, but and so not to be saying talk about individualism, but anyway, that's what rose up for me.
To that exact point, Elaine and Marisol both. As you were talking, I remember a paper I read that was published by PACE about the language that we use to describe different parts of our society have different ways of thinking about language. And we have to be really careful that our language is not exclusionary to this very point. And actually, patriotism was one of the words that they workshopped, that they did a focus group on. Yeah. And when you pair patriotism and activism, if you pair them and talk about patriotism and activism in the same way, then you get at what Elaine was describing as personal agency. When I work with, we have a student civic student leaders council, and when we work with the student civic leaders council, we were working around registering students to vote, and we said, you know, your vote is your voice. If you don't register, if you don't vote, you can't actually make your voice heard. So what does that mean to have a voice? And I think that it's so. Because I'm at a system, I have a lot of top-down thinking, you know, like what can we do here that can push things in the right direction? But ultimately, it is all bottom up. It is all getting, you know, yesterday's panel, I can't remember who it was, I think it was the history professor, who said that he doesn't teach people how to think about the text. The students enter the text from where they are, and they're the agent of understanding. So I agree. I think that we're, to the extent that the framework, you know, back to the original question, Carol, that you asked, does this framework carry over that traditional, that, you know, nostalgic orientation? We have to be real sensitive to where we are in this conversation. And the other thing I would add about why higher education, because we too, Elaine, we have a bill right now. I just wrote testimony for a bill that Maryland is going to be proposing the civic seal for both schools and for students. So there's going to, you know, and just I just put a plug in for our new governor. He is putting in place, he's putting a SERVE Act. He's proposing a SERVE Act, which would give students the first 2 years after high school the opportunity to work in a nonprofit, get paid minimum wage, which in Maryland is going to be $15 an hour for 30 hours a week, and take that as sort of a scholarship in addition to the pay to higher education. So building coalitions with our community at every level, I think, is really going to be important. So how we build that into the framework from the beyond the campus level, I think is a useful thing to think about.
And you're bringing up something that we've been thinking about a lot, and I would not pretend I think we have it right yet in this framework. We have students who are going to be coming out of apparently California and Maryland with civic seals because they have done so much already.
Right.
What is higher in the higher civic learning for them? Or do we just say, oh, you don't have to think about it for 2 years or 4 years? If we believe it should still be part of the education, how is it higher? At the same time, we've asked the students that we opened this forum series with a panel of students. So we asked them how civics had been addressed in their schooling before they got to college. 3 of them couldn't remember. That's how unempowering it was. Mm-hmm. The 4th is on his way to a role in politics, and he was much influenced by what he learned in high school. A young Republican, I should add. So we have to think in nuanced ways about how we're doing this. And again, the notion that the one course is going to solve everything. It just isn't. Right. Even though a lot of students may need that course in all its complexity and colonial attentiveness and comparative frameworks.
Well, I actually think our students, to the ones that come through with the Civic Seal, I think they can be our allies in this. They can help us figure out what higher education can do to the next level.
That is a very good point. I'm making notes.
And Carol, I was just going to add also that we want to make sure that we continue to not have a static notion of who the partners are in this. And we think about the ways that we can advance this cause in the various spheres, right? So some of the usual suspects like accrediting bodies and agencies, of course, would be, I think, another partner at the higher ed space, but then also thinking outside of the box in terms of folks who typically are not engaged in this type of discussion, like corporations and employment sector. Like, how do they get to engage in this? Because as they're also trying to recruit and create a vibrant workforce, they're going to want folks who are civically engaged and who have these experiences as well.
Yeah, and if I can add something that I would sort of love to see as we begin the conversations, to I think push against this sort of notion that we have right now of the other side as the enemy. Like, I feel like there needs to be more conversations about shared humanity. I appreciate the way that identity is centralized in the student's identity is centralized in this. We're really thinking about those spaces where shared humanity is really core to a thriving democracy. Like, we need to be able to see each other as full human beings, capable and willing to participate in order to push against this notion of the other side, being our enemy. And it's hard because, we've got a lot of media influence, our own political opinions, and the ways that the policies that we see coming down, at state levels, dehumanize us, right? We can name places right now that we see that happening. And so the more that we push against that, the more that we, think about folks who are not citizens in the legal status sort of way, but are very active members and citizens in our community, right? The more that we humanize their experiences, the more that we see the nuances of democracy play out, and we can have those conversations that lead to different results.
Well, believe it or not, we are at time. So I want to thank everyone, all of our panelists, for joining us. And thank you for your insights. Again, this is just the beginning of our critique and our continued solicitation of feedback related to this document. And for our listening audience and viewing audience, you can certainly find the framework at collegeciviclearning.org. And so there are instructions at the end of that website on how to make a comment into the document. We'd love to hear your feedback. So if you want to react to what the panelists have said, but also to weigh in on your own, please feel free to do so. And in terms of, we've heard a lot in this forum about the why of college civic learning and its benefits both to students and to a democracy in need of new talent and creativity. And so that's where we start this conversation. But now we're going to turn our attention to another important question, and that is, how do we overcome the many obstacles educators face in making college civic learning for an engaged democracy a priority for our institutions, our students, and our communities? So we've organized 4 concurrent sessions by sector: community colleges, liberal arts institutions, regional institutions, and research universities. And each of these is going to be led by seasoned educational leaders, and each will offer you practical advice on overcoming the obstacles we know all educators face as they continue to do this work. We've also organized a session on the new multi-state collaborative that you've heard about today from Nancy and others, the multi-state collaborative for civic and democratic learning that the CLD Coalition is organizing. And this is a chance for you to learn about what's happening and to actually contribute your own thoughts on how state systems can best support civic work on member campuses. And finally, there's going to be a concurrent session on the legislative restrictions that are emerging in many states and standing in our way of moving and advancing this work forward. So we hope you'll find all of these sessions useful, and we will see you back here at 4:15 for our final plenaries of the day. Until then, thank you for your time, attention, and engagement in this very important work. Goodbye now.